All right, so for this assignment, you're going to be doing a text animators. And obviously, we'll be working with other stuff in the process, but that's to be the big gist of this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set up what my scene is going to look like, okay? Because if I look at that other file, and I go to my render view, this is what it started off as, and that looks pretty ugly. And then eventually what I wanted to do was get rid of this. Every time you render something, you'll see like there's this ugly black line, or basically a line between the background and the foreground, and we don't want stuff like that to happen. Okay, so we want something like this. Now I also want to have shadows in here, so eventually I added shadows. I also wanted some reflections, so eventually I added reflections in here as well. Okay. So all of this is the first part of that setup. Once we have this set up, then we can use that same setup for every single one of our text pieces, change colors if we want to, whatever. So that's how we're going to start this one. Now these ones are going to take longer than the other ones to render out. Because we're doing more frames, like in the environment we only did 5 frames, and this one we're going to be doing 60 frames per item, it's going to take obviously longer to render out all that stuff. So I'm going to set this up with just a basic sphere to start off with. Yep, you're just watching, taking notes. Okay, and I want you to see the process of this. So if I rendered a sphere, that's what the sphere is going to look like. Now what I want to have is I want to create that vignette look, but I want to have some colors in the background and have a bit more control over it versus just like we did down here with the vignette. So I'm going to do a couple things. One of them, I'm going to create a background. So if I go to here, there's a floor that I can create, and then there's a background I can create. So I'm going to create a background. And this is kind of similar to the one we did before with the sky, where we had that sky way in the background. I'm going to make a new material. And I'm going to do the same little thing we did before with the gradient. And give it whatever colors I want. So at this point, it's not a sky, it's just like our color. So if my colors are orange and blue, or yellow and whatever, I can definitely pick that, okay? So let's say that I like green. Let's say that I don't like Brian and I just want to make him mad. He hates the color green, so I would definitely pick green. So I'm going to pick green. And then for this other one, I will pick a maybe lighter version of that green. Cool. All right, so now if I drop this on here, just so you can see, and I render it out, we get this. So my gradient is going from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. On the sky one, we rotated it so it was going from top to bottom. So in this, what I want to do is I'm going to change the kind of gradient from a 2D to a circular. And it's exactly that. It starts off right in the center and then goes out. I want the dark to be on the outside, so I swap my colors. Sides, that's a super bright green. Looks all right. And desaturate that a bit. And darken that a bit. There we go. That's acceptable there. Okay. So by default, anytime I make a material and I drop it onto a background, it automatically sets the projection type to frontal. So if you remember from the sky one that we did, we had to set it to be a frontal because by default it came in as something else, UVW or something. So now that we have this, boom, we have the background color. I want to create some way to catch shadows. Now what I don't want to do is lose the ability to tweak this shape afterwards, okay, or not tweak the shape, but lose this gradient that's on here. So if I just put in a ground plane, okay, so let's say I just did that. Oops, that's way too big. Let's just make it a little bigger. There we go. Okay, so I lose, obviously, the ground plane is cutting in the way of that, so that kind of ruins it. Also, if I decide I want to rotate my camera, I really have to make sure that this thing extends far enough that it doesn't get in the way. All right, so we're not going to use a plane for this because a plane is very limiting. Cinema 4D has this awesome thing called an infinite floor or an infinite plane. So if I go into that same area where I grabbed that background, I can also make a floor. And even though it only shows the floor right here, that floor actually extends for infinity. Okay, so I don't have to worry about scaling it up, which is, again, an awesome thing. You can see it goes right there. Now, in order to get the same material on the floor that's on the background, it's super simple. Just drag it onto the floor. And now when I render, I get that. Okay. Every object in Cinema, when you drop a new material on it, it places the material different. Okay. It's not always different. It's just always the same way. So for the floor, when I projected it, it does a flat one, which is basically just repeating that gradient pattern over and over. So I'm going to do, again, frontal, and then render, and then you'll see how that's set up. Right, frontal, both, yes. And I'm just going to double check my material here because color, yes. Frontal, both, next textures, tile. All right. I'm going to put some reflection on here so that I do get some reflection. I'm not sure why it's coloring it like that. Well, we'll get to that in a second. All right, so I'm going to add some area lights. So my item here, I want to have some shadows, so I'm adding a couple area lights. And these are just going to be basically from the front-ish view. Now, whenever you're adding lights, we have to consider two things. One, what does the light look like when it hits the item, but also what do the shadows look like? So if I position my light like where it's defaulted right here, what I'm going to get are very long shadows because the light is basically right in front of it and it's going to just spread these shadows out. Now that's not a terrible thing if we had a still image, but whenever you have an animation, those shadows are also animating too. So we want to basically have shadows but minimize them so they don't go crazy. So I'm going to rotate this like so. I'm going to move it into position. Remember which software I'm in. And you'll see me toggling with the W key to switch between the different kinds of rotate. So this one I'm rotating the light up and down. This one I'm able to rotate the light rotating side to side. Okay, so remember that changes the axis that this is on. And then I'm going to maybe give the light a little bit of color. So let's say I'm going to just a little bit of pinkish color. Like that. And I'm going to turn my shadows on, and because I have an area light, this will be an area light shadow. Oops. Let me pick my different angle here. All right, now I'm not sure why that floor is still coloring like that, because it definitely should not be. That's frontal, both. Shouldn't need tile on here. Maybe that's why I was doing it. Nope. Oh, I forgot one thing. In order for the floor to be actually like see-through and not have the background there, I have to right-click, go to Cinema 4D tags on the floor, and add what's called a compositing tag. And what this allows me to do is that when I render this, now I can turn on certain features, so I can tell it that the floor is not seen by the camera. So now the floor wouldn't be seen by the camera. Now, we lose our shadows when we do that, so I can't just do that. What tag was that? The compositing tag. So I'm going to tell it that I don't want the floor to cast shadows. I do want the floor to receive shadows. So now I can still see that. And compositing background. There we go. Okay. And then the other flag is compositing background. So now what I get is I get my floor, which is transparent basically. It's just being used as what's called a shadow catcher. And other softwares will have this too. You can actually use that if I had a picture of this room and I wanted to put my sphere on top of a table and I had a picture of that table, I could basically put a plane inside Cinema, put the sphere where it would be sitting, and put that as a shadow catcher, and it'll look like the shadows are falling onto the table, which is awesome. Cool. So now I can play with the kinds of shadows that I'm getting here. I'm just going to scoot that off to the other side for a second. I'm going to go to my light, and then under my light, I'm just going to play with like the density. So maybe 50%. Now, the area lights have several controls of how this shadow is being created. One is the density, just how thick and black is that shadow. The other area is how big the light is. The bigger the light, the more spread out that shadow is going to be. So just by changing the density, that will change the softness of that shadow some, the coloring. But if I really want to spread that shadow out, I have to grab the light and just make it bigger. Like so, and like so, and like so. So now I'm going to have this nicer shadow kind of in the scene. Okay. Now my item is floating. You can definitely see that because it's not touching the ground. And that's going to be fine because I don't need it to actually touch the ground. I don't see my reflections, so let's go to our material. Let's take the reflection strength up some and then render it out. Let's take the roughness down some. There we go. Let's take this all the way down and all the way up. There it is. Okay, so now we can see the sphere reflecting down here. Reflections are based off of bounce. So if I have an item sitting on top of the plane, if I'm at a weird angle, there's no way that I'm going to see that reflection. Okay, so I have to make sure that my camera is kind of positioned so that I can see the reflection. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. So I'll show you if I just kind of rotate my camera down some like this and then render again, now we can see more of that reflection inside there. If my item's closer to the ground, the reflection will also be stronger. So it's stuff to be aware of. I'm going to take, I took this to Beckman, which is a good one to change it to. And then I'm just going to increase my roughness. Because again, I don't want anything crazy reflection-wise. I just want the hint of a reflection in there. Okay, all of these we can adjust later too once we get our actual items in the scene. But right now it's just kind of like setting up the stage so that everything works good. All right, so I like that. That looks good. All right. So let me rename my material. So this will be my floor material. And BG. Okay, and just to go over the settings that I did, I changed the color to a gradient. I made it a 2D circular. The light color is on the left. The dark color is on the right. I added some reflection to it. And then the floor has a compositing tag with no cast shadows and compositing background on. If cast shadows is on, sometimes you'll get a line like right at the edge of where that is. So you don't want that. And then like we saw, if this isn't on, then we won't see this blend together. Okay? Cool. So I have one light. I'm going to add another light into my scene. So I'm just going to duplicate this one to the other side and then rotate it like that. And I'm just going to back the lights off just a little bit. There we go. Now, the other thing we have to worry about is competing shadows, right? So if I have one light on the right side casting shadows and one light on the left side casting shadows, every time my items animate, I'm going to have these two shadows that are just kind of bouncing around. And that can be annoying to see. So I may want to just take one of my lights and just not have shadows on that one, or turn the shadows way down, or make the light bigger so I don't see it as much. Okay? I'm just going to turn them off. That way I only have one shadow from my scene. Okay? In some 3D worlds, 3D scenes, you'll have multiple lights, and some lights are simply just to light up this one area. If you've ever seen Finding Nemo, in those underwater scenes, there was like 200 lights in some of those environments just to create that look of underwater. I'm not really happy with the dark green on that, so I'm going to tweak it, but that's the last tweak I'm going to do on this. The idea here is that you can pick whatever colors you want, okay, within reason. Don't pick like crazy colors like bright blue and... This isn't the light, this is the background. So I'm just changing the vignette here. I just wanted that to be a little bit darker there. Yes, add a little bit of color to the light because you'll see like the item will get a nice little cast to it. And the way that I choose my colors is based off of a color wheel or based off of a formula. So if I go here and I pick these greens, just so you can see, the way that colors work, if you remember a color wheel, it's like a 360-degree rotation. So if the green that I chose was at 99, let's just round this to 100 for ease of doing it. If I were just to add 180 to this, I would get 280, which if you see is like in the pink area. So that's why I chose pink for the lights, because pink is the complementary color of that green that I chose. Okay. These two greens here are related to each other because they're the same hue, just different saturations and different values. Okay. Cool. So this here, all of this, oops, plus my camera. What happened to my camera? I thought I had one. All right. I'm going to make a camera real quick and just kind of set this up. It'll change where it's at, but for now it'll work. Okay, I just want to make sure that I have that. These 5 items right here, that's going to be the same pretty much for every one of our views. I don't want to change my shots. I don't want to have a different camera angle for each one of these. I want everything to be basically shot from the same viewpoint. Okay, so for all of my items, these are going to be the same. So I'm going to group all of these and call them environment. Okay, now what's awesome about this is once you have a setup like this, you can use this for anything. I could drop a product into here and render out my product. If you go to the internet and you look up product rendering, especially Cinema 4D stuff, because it's very popular in Cinema 4D to do product rendering like that, you'll see stuff very similar. So something very similar to what we just did, very similar to what we just did, very similar to what we just did. Okay, so you can see that this effect is used like pretty much all over the place. In some instances, they want that line there, so you can see right here how they do have the line. In some instances, they don't, like these two here. Okay, so this setup, once it's done, you could take this into any file and render out your stuff, and it makes it 10 times easier than having to start from scratch or having to, work around other methods. Sweet. So there's our environment. I'm going to also throw this onto a layer. So if you remember, whenever I grab an item and I make a new layer, and I call this, I'll just call it ENV for now, it only assigns the item I have selected to that layer. And this may sound stupid, but the stuff that's inside here does not get assigned to that layer. I don't know why, but whatever. If I want to, I can do 2 things. One, I can just click and drag all these. That assigns it. Okay, so I'm dragging that layer straight down. Or I can grab all the individual items, right-click, and then add them to the layer. That's another thing to do. The easiest thing to do is just right-clicking on this. You can add, select the children, which is everything under it, and then add it. Okay, and that'll make your life a lot easier, because if you had layers and groups and layers and groups, you don't have to select it all. You just do that and it does it. So now everything's on that layer. Sweet. I should also probably save this at some point. I copied my template project, so remember we did that before. We copied the template. I have one called titles. There it is. And I'm going to drop this into my scenes. Sarcona logo design. Okay. All right. So the sphere that we used was simply placement. Just kind of like what is things going to look like in the scene. That's all I need to do. Okay. I deleted the sphere. It's gone. So now I'm going to create text. Several different ways to create text inside Cinema. Just so you can see this other way, we're not going to use this way, but just so you can see it. Under spline text, you can create text. You can type stuff in. There it is. And then you can use the extrude. So I just drop this extrude under it. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Drop this under the extrude. There we go. And now it'll create like actual 3D text. And then inside this extrude, I can do things like how many subdivisions are here, how much movement is there, what kind of caps do I have. Right now these are just flat, but do I have a fillet cap, which is something that's rounded, and so on. Okay, so the extrude one is great for some things, but it's not really what I want to use, okay, because it's kind of limiting. Under MoGraph, there is a Mo text. Okay, so MoGraph, if you ever see any Cinema 4D stuff that's like crazy animations, things linked together, that kind of thing, typically MoGraph is in there somewhere. So under MoText, it does pretty much what the other one did, but it does it all within one node. Okay, so instead of me having to create text on one area and then extrude it and then have to keep going back and forth, everything is under this one thing, and then I'm able to do other stuff with it. So inside here, I'm going to type in my text. Now, you should use some form of your name. Sarcona is a crazy long name, 7 letters. The bigger my name is, who's got a long name in here? Anyone has a really long last name? You do. Yeah. So some people like 10 or 15 letters. If I want to show that whole thing, I got to be zoomed out pretty far, okay? So I don't want that. So you guys probably don't watch Tosh.0 because you're good people, but I'm a horrible person, so I do. So he always has these Tosh.0 logos and these 3D text things. Those are all done Cinema 4D MoGraph stuff. So I'm just going to do Sarc.0. I can change this later, which is awesome. At any point, like right before I render, I can type in whatever I want, and it'll still update. So long as I don't hit C, okay? Something with your name, okay? So your first name and last name are very long, so you can just do like Cam, or you can do whatever, something that's short if you have a nickname or whatever. If you want to use a word, it doesn't matter, okay? As long as you have something that's short and concise, that we can get the idea across, okay? Pick a good font, okay? Just because it's listed here does not mean that it's a good font to use. Something like this is not a good font to use. That looks horrible, and you can even see that MoGraph kind of freaked out and didn't know what to do there, okay? So typically stuff that works good are thick, boldy fonts, okay? So something like Anki. I don't know if that's on every computer here, but that could work, but then my A looks like a D, so I don't want that. Oswald, that one looks all right. Even some like this, you know, you can get away with, but typically I think I used that one before. That's a good one. Okay. So Proxima, Nova, RG. Again, you can play with the kind that it is. Bold, you can see this looks pretty bad, but then the bold, that looks pretty decent. Okay. Now here's where the benefit of using MoGraph is we can adjust like so many things here. Like you can adjust the horizontal spacing of your letters. So if you want to worry about kerning, you can definitely play with the kerning there. You could even open up this and really play with the tracking, kerning, horizontal scales, and all that. The other text tool does not have any of those features inside there. And if you look at these, any of these can be animated too. So you can animate these things like moving in and going apart and whatever. We can play with the depth. So again, just like the other one had, here's the depth. And then here's the subdivisions, okay? Now, we want to set up our text so that it is universally used across all of our text animators. So whatever we choose here, we're going to use that same font and the same basically chunk of text for all 3 of them. Don't change your text, just keep it the way it is. So if I choose this font, I'm using that font. If I'm going from these computers to the home computer and I'm working, make sure you have the same font in there because it'll look for that same font, okay? I also want to align this to the middle. That way life is easier. There we go. I want to add a little bit of a beveling around here, so I'm going to go to my caps. And I turned on my lines here so you can see this, so display Gorad shading lines. And I'm going to add a fillet cap and a fillet cap. And then I'm just going to lower my radiuses. Okay, so 3 steps, and then my radiuses are 2 centimeters. If I modeled this huge, I need to change those numbers. If I modeled it tiny, I need to change those numbers. The default settings, that worked for me. So don't ever look at what my settings are and think that they're going to be perfect across the board. Use your own settings. Look at, if I'm out here like this, I can see a nice little rounding happening here. If I change this to something like 0.1, you can't even see that there's a little rounding there. It's totally gone, okay? Or if I go the opposite direction, then that looks ridiculous, right? So 2 is good for this scene, for that. You can also change the kind of fillet that it is. So if we look at, this is a fillet slash bevel slash, that's called different things. I can change this from a convex to linear, which is just straight. So you can see how it's just angled straight. If I did that, I really don't need to play with the steps. okay, because the steps would be the exact same thing for either one. If I went to concave, you'll see how it rounds in. If I went to half circle, there's that, and so on. So you can play with all of those and see what the different ones are. The default one is perfect. I'm going to use that. Some of the other options that are here too are hull inward. So if you look at, oops, I was on the wrong side. If you look at the top of this, you can see how that dips in. And if I go to hull inward, you can see how this then goes in. Okay, so you can play with each one of those things. There's also constrain, which is locking the text basically to invisible curves. We can't see them, but there's invisible curves there. Okay, you'll see that it does change that slightly, like, right? So that might be too thick. Regular's too thin. That might get me right in the middle of where I need to be. I actually do like it better like that. Okay, sweet. So that works. All right, so now what I'm going to do, I make sure my lines are on. I need to have even divisions across this thing, okay? So if I look at, let me pick a different color here, just so I can see this better. Drop this on there. And then make this, there we go, just so we can see those lines better. If you look at the lines here, I want to have even divisions. So on this C, this face right there is one big face. These pieces here are tiny pieces, but these are even tinier. And if I go into like the R, you can definitely see there's some discrepancy in sizing. So I want to have everything pretty even. One of the things we're going to do is an explosion, which will basically take each face and separate each face. So what I don't want to have is like the front of my R is one solid face, and then I have all these tiny pieces going around that. Okay. So on that mo text, there's two spots that we need to adjust. One is the object, okay, down here at the bottom where it says intermediate points. This is going to control all the divisions going around this shape. So all of these lines right here, that's what that's going to control. If I change this number, okay, and this may be, don't worry about what they're actually doing. Just know right now that you can click it and see the changes, right? So as I go smaller, these get smaller. As I go bigger, those get bigger, okay? And obviously you can hit a point where maybe this is too chunky and no longer smooth. Obviously we wouldn't want that, okay? This intermediate points adaptive is basically wherever it needs to have curvature, like this, it puts a lot of divisions. Wherever it's straight, like this, it puts no divisions. So that's what it's adapting to the kind of surface that we have, okay? You can also do uniform, which means have uniform divisions all over. That's the one we want to do. That way everything is pretty uniform across the board. We can also play with the amount of divisions here again, just to make sure that it looks good. So in this case, I think 14 is a good number for me. I'm looking at the crook of the R right there. If you go back to, let's say right there, you can see there's like a weird like crack. So if I go even lower, you'll see I get these weird spots. If I go really low, holy cow, I've lost everything. All right, so 14 looked like it was a good number. Cool. All right, everything's still nice and round. Everything's pretty even there. You can, again, experiment with other methods if you want to check those out too. You know, you can see what those do. Now, for the caps, which are these pieces here, they have their own way to subdivide them. Even though the C subdivided itself here, the O didn't, the dot didn't, the A didn't. So inside the caps, I'm going to go down here to type and choose quads. And this will give me quads. Now, it doesn't do a perfect job. You'll see some of these are still triangles. But what I can do is turn on regular grid. And then this creates, it looks kind of funky, but it'll create something a little bit more interesting once we actually explode this into different pieces. So if I change this to quads, and then I can lower the size of it. So something about there seems like it's pretty good. Okay. So I've gone to my object, I changed this to uniform, updated my points. I went to caps, I changed my quadrangles, I regular gridded it, and I set mine to 5. Yours might be different. Now the last area I need to worry about is this space right here. So I would still get a bunch of like little strips. That looks weird. So I go back to my object. Up here at the top where it says depth and subdivisions, I just add enough subdivisions that it looks pretty uniform across. Okay. Now if you don't have this shading on and your item isn't selected, you won't see any of those lines. With the shading on, you do see those lines. Okay? So for this part of the assignment, that's the only time we need to see this is when we are adjusting these. Once we've adjusted them, we're good. So I can turn that back off. Cool. All right, so I can leave it as mo text, that's fine. And I'm just going to duplicate this and drag it down. Okay, so this will be my template one. All the other stuff I create, I'm going to create based off of one of those. At any point, I can come back and type something new, just like I said before, and it'll update all of those things. Okay, so actually, before I get any further, I think I need to just take my horizontal spacing and just squeeze it in a bit. There we go. It's better. Oops. Yeah, that's good enough. Okay. You can also draw stuff in Illustrator, line it up exactly how you want it, and bring that in and do this whole process to that as well. Okay, so that's also a possibility. Sweet. So now I'm satisfied with that, so I'll go on here, and I'll just call this mo text original. All right, so this one I'm just going to hide for now, so I'm just going to check these little boxes to get rid of it. All right, so now I'm going to play with this. Now the first one that we're going to do is going to be a simple one, just animating these characters coming into screen. So if you've had me for After Effects, I think Sean Sheehan does it too. One of our things we do as animators, where we animate the scaling of an item or the opacity of an item or whatever. So this one's going to be animating the scale and the rotation. So if you remember before, we used these cloners, and that cloner allowed us to move stuff around and have it cloned in different areas. Okay? So the cloner and motext are in the same area. So anything that's inside here, we can use an effector on. And we used, at one point I showed the formula one, we're going to use the linear, or the plane one. Okay? So what this plane one will do is it'll automatically move everything to whatever the coordinates are, or the parameters are. So right now this plane, I click the motext, I made the plane, it's moving everything up whatever this Y unit is. Okay? So I'm just going to reset the Y. What I want to do is I want it to rotate and scale and like pop into frame. So I'm going to turn off position. I'm going to turn on scale. We'll do scale first. And then what I want to do is scale everything down to 0. Okay? Now you'll see the way this is set up that everything is already 0, so it's kind of weird. You have to set it to -1. And now everything is like 0, whatever. Okay? I'm also going to make sure it's set to uniform and absolute. Now you'll see when I check those that this resets. No big deal, I just type that in. Okay, so now what this does is it takes our text and it scales it all down to super tiny. We can play with this thing. Oops, there it is. We can play with this thing to control where it comes in, or all of them at the same time. But what I want to do is be able to control them individually. I want to be able to control the S and the A and the R and the whatever. So under the fall off, that's where I can control that. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to create a shape, and then as my shape moves through the text, it'll actually like animate those pieces coming into frame. Okay, so if I change this to linear, it makes this. You can't see it that good from that angle. There it is. So I'm going to rotate this around. That way. And then now as I move this, you can see how that text is now animating from the scale. Mm-hmm. Now, does anything bother you about how it's scaling in? Yeah, it's from the middle, and that looks weird, right? It should be kind of like from the bottom, right? So I'm going to put this to an about area where I can see a letter coming in, like that. I'm going to go to my plane, I'm going to go to my parameters, and under the transform space, this is where I can tell it where are you actually going off of. So if I say object or effector, nope. Neither of those want to play nice, so I will go to that's where I change it. I go to my motext, it's not on the plane. I thought it was on the plane. that's something else. I go to my mode text, and under letters, I can change the axis point right here. So I'm going to change this, and what you'll see is, as I'm doing that, you'll see these dots are moving down. Okay, so if I move it right there on this to 0, and then I go through my plane, and I animate, you'll see now they scale up from the bottom, which is obviously what we wanted that to happen. Sweet. Okay, so that's how we do that. Now we want to rotate them into position. Okay, actually, sorry, we don't want to rotate them in position yet. What I want to do is have them kind of not just scale up like this, because that's kind of boring, just like scaling up and stopping. I want them to kind of overshoot, so I want them to get bigger and then get smaller. Okay, so I'm going to create another plane. So I'm just going to take this one and duplicate it, and I'll call this one the first scale plane. I'll call this one the overscale plane. Okay. Now once I've created the other one, you'll see that it doesn't affect my text anymore. It's like not doing anything. I have to make sure I go to my mode text, I go to my letters, and I drop the other one inside that list. Okay, so now they're both affecting it. And this is what's neat about that, is we can turn these off or turn these on. We can reorder them so one thing happens before another thing before another thing. It's pretty cool. So now on my overscale, I'm going to go to my parameters, and instead of this being 1, I'm going to set this to, maybe not that much, 0.5. Okay? So now you can see how this will scale up each one of the letters. Okay? So now here's how this is going to work, is that I'm going to have both of these kind of in the same position, like this. Okay? So they're not right on top of each other, they're offset a little bit. The overscale is before the other one. Okay? So what's going to happen is the first one comes through and starts scaling it up, like the S is getting scaled up, and then at some point the overscale is starting to take effect, and it'll scale it up even more. Once it gets past both of those, then it just goes back to its default size. Okay, so very cool. Boop, 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 boop. Okay, now we can do another one. We can create another plane and do the same thing, but let's just see if we can just add to the first plane just that rotation. Okay, so I'm going to add a rotate, and I'm going to say 180 degrees. So now what should happen is, as I pull back, you'll see how it shrinks down. That's awesome, right? Maybe not 180. I had 180 on my first one. I think 90 might be a better number, or even like 120. I just don't want it butting into the other one. There it goes. Yeah, 120 looks good. Sweet. Okay, so now for the animation part, all we have to do is just animate these two things going across, which is super simple, right? So what we don't want to do is animate both of these individually. I want to group them together. I want to call this scalars, and then I want to animate that. Okay? Bless you. So I'm going to move this all the way to the left until my text goes away. So right there, that's the second it went away, or the frame it went away. And then I'm just going to change my coordinates and just set one keyframe here. Now, as long as I've been moving just the one arrow, life is easier, okay? Don't move more than one arrow, you don't need to. So just that X direction, I set a key at 0, so my keyframe's at 0. I'm going to go up to 60. I'm going to move this across, again, right until it goes to the very end. Right there, okay? And then I set my other keyframe. So now I can rewind this, hit play. Awesome. And then I can render it out and see what it looks like. That green on green is not working for me. Let me just change that color real quick. that's looking good. You'll see that my C is getting kind of cut in the middle here. I don't want that, so I'm going to take my floor and just lower it down. Okay? So I just grab the floor and lower that down. Right? And now you can really see that reflection in here. So you can see that, and then I can go back and adjust what that reflection is looking like. So maybe if I take the roughness up, it'll take the reflection, keep it as much as it is, but spread it out so it'll look like it's less. Like that. So you can definitely see there's some kind of pinkish hue down here. If I pull the roughness tighter, you can see the letters. But then if I just take the reflection strength down, the letters will just be still in the same shape, but they'll be lighter, okay? So just think about that kind of stuff as you're creating it, like what do I want the reflections to look like? Do I want them clear but light, or do I want them to be kind of diffused? Typically for something like this, I like to go a little bit softer so that it's still kind of visible that that's their reflection. Okay, something like this where you can kind of see it starting and then it fades off. All right, that's cool. And then I can look at the lighting too and see, do I like the lighting where it is? I think I want to adjust my lights a bit. Let me just scoot this over. I think this light, and I may want to just add another light here. Just another light in the middle. And this is going to be my shadow light. So I'm going to turn shadows off on my other lights. Shadow, none, shadow, none. Now the more lights you add to your scene, the brighter it's going to be, obviously. So you may have to balance out your lights. So the first one that we did is really our kind of like setup for the rest of our ones. So we really want to kind of hammer in like what's the lighting looking like. These shadows here look a lot nicer than these shadows kind of going off to the side. This is way too bright though. The pink is like just screaming at us. So we need to take the light intensities down. Let's say 50 for those. And that one should be good at 100. Nope. Just cancel that. Maybe we'll make this middle one like 150. All right, that looks good. Right, I'll play with the colors later too. All right, sweet. Okay, so my environment is still going to be my environment. It's still going to stick for all my other ones. I've adjusted everything that's inside here the way that it's inside there. These two items, which are my text and my scalars, these are part of my first text animator, which is my scale and rotate. So I'm going to group those together so I have them together. Scale, rotate, text. I'm going to drag them to a layer, so I'll make another new layer from the selection, and I will call this scale, rotate, layer. Now, just like before, I have to select the children, and then add that to the layer, and then now, just so you can see it, I can turn it on and off, okay? Because we'll eventually have 3 of these in the same scene, so we want to make sure that we have everything nice and organized, right? So just so you're aware, I think I mentioned this before, the V here with the eyeball, that turns it off for what's visible in your scene. But even though it's not visible in the scene, it still renders because the next checkbox in that list is what renders. And I have like a weird thing right there. I want to get rid of that. I gotta see what that is. This one right here. So if I turn off this renderable, now it will not render my text at all. Okay? So obviously this will be important because as we turn our layers off, we need to turn both of those checkboxes off. Let me go to this material. Let me go to its reflection. Yep, I didn't adjust any of this. So I'll set this to Beckman. I'm going to take the roughness up, take the reflection strength down. Yep, that looks ugly. It's too much. You may want to also tint the color of this. So I'm going to tint the color of the reflection itself. And what that will do is, if you look at this here, we'll look at the before and after. Instead of it being just like a white reflection that just kind of like washes it out, it'll be that same color. And so the reflection down here will look nicer, and the reflection up there will look nicer as well. So this is still thinking. So you can see how long it's taking for one frame of this. I think I still have my settings at a higher setting, though, so I should probably take those down. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. I could probably knock it down a little bit on the lighting just so I have more of a shading. Yeah, I feel like I'm losing a little bit of the shading in here just because of how bright the lights are, but I'm going to tweak that. And I think I want to adjust the reflection on here, so I'm going to add some roughness, pull the reflection strength down. Cool. All right, so now let's pretend that I'm ready to render this. Oops. Make sure I go to my camera, which I'm in. I'm going to lock this to like that. Make sure this is still good. Yep, that's working. Okay. I'm going to go to my render settings. I will go to save my file and titles, renders. That was in the right folder. And I have to give this a name. So this will be my title scale rotate. There it goes. I'm saving it as a TIFF, 8 bits a channel. The bottom one here, which is name.number.extension. Everything else should be good in this one. Under output, 960 by 540. And we're only rendering frames 1 through 60. 1 through 60. And under anti-aliasing, I'm setting this to best anti-aliasing and Mitchell for the filter size, filter type. Okay. Now what that's going to do is setting this to best is going to give us nice clean edges. Setting that to Mitchell will help how it's blending those edges together. And then there's one more thing that I want to do that's not an option inside here. I need to switch this to physical and turn on what's called motion blur. Okay? So just like in After Effects, let me go to a good frame like that. If I hit Shift R now, it's going to render all my frames. I don't want to hit Shift R now because I've already set it up. If I hit Control R, it'll just render inside this view. So what motion blur is going to allow us to do is see the motion of these things moving. It'll actually blur the edges of our 3D stuff. If I had a helicopter propeller spinning, it's not going to look like a helicopter propeller spinning unless I add motion blur to that. Okay? So motion blur will be kicked on. You can kind of see it a little bit there. 4 subdivisions is probably more than we need. We can probably get by with 3 subdivisions. And then where it says sampling quality, we'll set this to high. Now because I've gone through and taken this with motion blur kicked on and with this subdivision sampling set to high, this will definitely take longer to render per frame than it was taking a second ago. So just like I recommended with your environment, when we go to the next one, and I'll show it too, we want to basically turn all these settings back down, play with the stuff until we get it good, and then crank the settings back up when we do our final render. Because you can see here, this is still rendering. Okay, this is 30 seconds in, and this is how far it's gotten. Okay, now I'm looking at, as I'm kind of eyeballing this, I'm looking at the amount of shading here, and this looks really nice how we're getting this nice line of shading there. We're getting a nice highlight going around here, and we get the darkness there. Like that looks really awesome. Cool. All right. Let me show you DJV. I hate different browsers. I just want my regular one. P drive there, 2510, titles, renders. There we go. So in here, you can see the motion blur in action right there, how it's nice and soft around those edges. That's what the motion blur is going to give us. Without that, everything is just going to look too crisp and too clean inside the view. Okay, now this will be the last one that we do, but even though this one breaks, we can also animate it backwards in After Effects and have it come together. Cool. So that's still thinking. I'm just going to click off to let that go away. All right, so that'll be the first one. So as you're rendering these things, you can jump into another version of Cinema. You can actually just hit File New, and it'll open a new window, and then you can bounce between the two windows and work on the one while you're working on the other. Just make sure you're saving your stuff accordingly. Cool? Yes, sir.
My thing is still rendering.
On the window, you can just go inside the old one and also go into the new one that you create.
Yep. You can have different versions of your stuff open. So you can just hit Control N and make a brand new file, and the other one is still right there.
But we can't do it on the same file that we just did that one. It has to be on a different one. When we do the next,
A different folder?
yeah, when we do the next scaling.
Oh, you mean the next item here? You're going to do it in the same exact file.
Oh, it's the same.
Yep, we're going to do it in the same exact one. Because that way we can take the text here, keep the environment, and then just make everything animated again. And the rest of them are going to have the same principles as this one did, except we're going to be using different effectors inside here and different features there, okay? The more you kind of play with these, like there's so many opportunities and things available for what you can do, like just in this area. Cool? Sir?
So what if we don't quite get this one done today?
You probably won't get this one done today. I'm just going to show the next one next class. That way you have both of these to kind of work on. As we get further into this, you'll find that while something's rendering, there's literally nothing to do. So you want to have something available to do while that's going on, especially with the size of this class. Even if, because when you do render and you do work on other stuff, your computer is going slow, you could switch to the computers behind you or wherever and work on that one too. And that way you kind of have double duty. The longer you stay in 3D, you'll see some people will even take up 3, 4, 5 computers, and they're just rendering, like this one's rendering frames 1 through 100, this one's 100 through 200, and so on. And it's massive. Okay?
And we're also doing drawings. You're checking our drawings.
I'm checking your drawings today, yep.